Okay, so Thursday night I went down hard. I was feeling massively under the weather. Today I'm feeling a lot better. Friday, well, I was feeling about the same. So, now that I'm feeling a little better, I'm going to be watching episode 24, Beyond Axum, from Star Wars vs. 40K, from a fan with too much time on his hands. Um, a little bit loud, huh? In any case, I was told that this was a really good one, so I wanted to be feeling better so I could actually sit here and enjoy it instead of feeling like crap, you know what I mean? Anyway, here we go.
Heresy. It looked like heresy. That reason alone was enough to build the bile in the back of Orion's throat. The Skywatch were proud, pure sons of Gulliman, but they were not perfect. Their Gene Father, honored before all but the Emperor himself,
Bullshit.
had not been perfect. Either by flaw of planning or translation, the Codex Astartes had failed Orion, and his chapter had left them in ruin. So they had adapted, changed, and at times deviated from what his brothers in other chapters would call the right path. In all of these changes, he was more than complicit, even if he did not originally enact them. But he would stand by them, all of them, each and every deviation, even before the judgment of his own Primarch. But of all of the deviations they had embraced, this one, surely, was the one he feared the most. The chapter master of the Skywatch resented the very aesthetic of the Librarius, if it could even be called that any longer. The old Marine was always made profoundly uncomfortable each time he was forced to come here. And already, despite not being within the walls of the Librarius proper, he could feel the twitches and emotion-laden sensations which signaled the beginning of his undesired anxiety. Lodged deep within the center of the Herald of Justice was the Circle of Vigilance, the organization which had come to replace the standard function of their chapter's former reservoir of psychic learning. Orion was old, but not nearly old enough to play witness to those strange founding times, when the first chapter masters of his venerable order made the controversial decisions that led to this. The circle was not actually a single ring, but 10 interlocking rings, rooms, and passages designed for the exact purpose of this place. Within the outer 9 rings, no sign of anything one could call a Librarius could be seen. Instead, layered and warded fortifications were presented. The witch-warded warriors, the Space Marine Neo-Watchers of his chapter, stood guard here, holding their vigil over their considerable defenses. They wore a wholly different panoply, donning burnished red armors and thick silver robes denoting them as what they were. Though most nodded their heads in his direction, and some even saluted his presence as he passed them, the chapter master of the Skywatch remained keenly aware of the fact that these were not his Marines. Not anymore. They belonged to Watchmaster Zarak, even if, ostensibly, the Watchmaster himself belonged to Orion. Despite this, the lack of direct authority over these warriors was not what he disliked most about the fortified outer rings of the structure. No, even if the Neo-Watchers acted as their own demi-chapter more often than he would like, even if their creation and maintenance put his entire chapter at risk of scrutiny and inquisitorial sanction, they were, if anything, the least troubling aspect of this entire arrangement. These men were loyal, powerful, and every one had worn the blue skin and gold eyes of the Skywatch before becoming a Neo-Watcher. What truly made Orion's ancient hackles rise as he made his way deeper and deeper into the Circle of Vigilance was their weapons. thrice blessed and sanctified by the ecclesiarchal hierophant of Mentessa Prime, bearing null blades, blank rounds, and even the vitally precious and always rare psych-out grenades. What bothered Orion was not the nature of the rare arsenal, it was its orientation. With every choke point, hard point, pillbox, killing zone, and gun
That is an arsenal for fighting psychers. Like an absolute arsenal.
emplacement facing inward towards the final innermost ring where resided the true psychic resource of the chapter, the Warlock Vigilance of the Skywatch. These details served as constant, if subtle, reminders of the unnatural nature of this arrangement, and how dangerous this particular deviancy from the Codex truly was. And yet he tolerated it, for while it was a terrible burden and risk on his chapter, it was also an undeniable strength, and one which had saved the Skywatch from certain failure on countless occasions. Throughout their many millennia of constant struggle and warfare, the different masters of the chapter had chosen to utilize the Warlocks in a variety of ways. From more traditional combat roles, as anti-demonic strike forces, mind-eating interrogators, and more. Orion, however, preferred to use them for a different purpose: intelligence. With their eyes buried in the warp, they could find sight beyond sight, and had on many occasions gifted Orion with insights which lent him strategic guidance. Large red and silver garbed devastators lumbered alongside him. Blessed heavy flamers presented forward and lit, as if they expected a sudden swarm of gene stealers to storm them the instant they opened. The chapter master felt a cold sweat sheen his forehead as he felt his grip over the large blade he held tighten with a soft sigh of servo muscles. Orion had a frighteningly small amount of understanding as to why this place affected him so, and had 1,000,001 rationalizations for the nervous reaction he constantly displayed when approaching the chapter's psychers. Yet not one satisfied him. The answer he had decided to settle upon, at least for now, was simply that this place was as wrong as it was undeniably necessary. The entryway before him was large, both wide and tall enough for 2 dreadnoughts to walk side by side and still have room to spare. They were composed of ancient silver and electrum stained with age and strife, and cloaked in an almost invisible sheath of pale, bristling mist. Orion filled his lungs with a subtle breath, not looking away from the doors or the high Gothic script engraved into them. He nodded without veering his eyes, and the doors creaked in response. The servos and mechanisms which held them shut began to relax before tensing again as they pulled in the opposite direction, beginning the process of opening the towering silver gates. Pale, hoary frost swiftly crawled out and across the doors from the seam in its center, coating the ancient credo depicted there with white, fur-like ice, before it was split in half by the opening of the passage beyond. He nearly spoke the words aloud, agreeing with the ancient sentiment even as he resented the double meaning he always found there. The old words upon the doors read, "Knowledge is power, guard it well."
Huh?
The band played like their lives depended
Huh. I'm just letting this one go. But yeah.
on it, as they did every time. And every time, Boba knew they were right to assume it. The young Fett clone had been grooming and growing his skills since his defeat in the attempted rescue of a Jedi from Count Dooku. Luckily, that client had paid in advance, and it had not taken him long to bounce back. Even now, he was admiring his recently repaired armor and newly integrated weaponry. It would be years yet before he grew large enough to truly inherit his father's Beskar. But until then, Jabba's credits and the equipment they made available for him would serve as a fine buffer. The Slug and his pale, tentacle-headed attendant had started to take a liking to Fett and his crew of hunters, though this time he found himself languishing alone. Sitting within a booth near the wall, he felt the empty spaces where Dengar, Bosk, and the others would linger, though their absence was not necessarily an unwelcome sensation. The others had been busy spending their credits on personal vacations, personal matters, or had, like himself, decided to take time off in the form of a few private jobs. He had no idea how theirs had fared, but the Fett was now sitting on a tidy pile of funds that no one had to know too much about, in addition to his new equipment. He wasn't much for Jabba's frequent parties, but he also recognized that just by attending them, he'd single himself out in the Slug's mind, and that was just as much a part of the job as anything else. He was polishing his left gauntlet, rubbing a fine cloth across the durasteel which protected his knuckles, when he felt it. A sudden chill. He was quite attuned to it by now, the soft call of his instincts, and in the constant heat of Tatooine, it was even easier to notice than usual. He felt hairs lifting around his body, meeting the inside of his suit, his every silent cell beginning to scream a warning. Danger was approaching. He took his helmet off the table in front of him and slid it on, activating his seals and running a quick check on his weapons, both the holstered ones and integrated units. It was as he concluded this that he heard the first signs of it, a rumble, and then what sounded like muffled clapping. Though he was not the only one to hear the sudden and evidently approaching ruckus, the band refused to stop playing until Bib Fortuna began to frantically wave a clawed hand in their direction. The music died, and the many associates, enforcers, dancers, hunters, slaves, smugglers, and assorted scum who filled the main room hushed their conversations, laughter, and debates, listening as one. What had at first sounded like claps and thumps were now recognizable as the throaty blasts of some kind of weapon. Gamorrean guards shuffled from the room, pushing out the door in a mob of eager, grunting muscle and fat. Soon their squeals and screams joined the distant noise, but not for long. "Broboja!" bellowed the hut in the center of the room. "Probo Jabba Ubufugi!" Bib snapped out right afterward. Most of the armed men inside rose to the call, and Boba would have followed as well were it not for the fact that he hadn't heard any promise of credits along with that command. Fett knew huts well enough to know better than to expect unpromised recompense from them. So as the other bounty hunters formed a wall of blasters and blades between the entryway and their slimy master, Boba instead lowered himself under the table of his booth and took a knee, waiting. He didn't need to wait long. The shadows of massive figures loomed in the late sun's light, painting the pale bend into the room black for a few meager moments. Large, round shoulder pads struck the side of a set of Junker's chimes. Jabba's men cried out as one and opened fire, and fire answered them in turn. A plume of billowing, roaring hell met the uneven wall of bodies. Blaster fire was sent into the flames, but the towering figure behind them did not so much as flinch or falter as he was struck. The weapon cut out, but the flames clung to the men they touched, roars of battle morphing into screams of hellish pain as the invading warriors entered, 5 in total. Dressed in mechanized suits of green armor, which was heavily caked in alien livery and symbols, they entered without hesitation, silencing the roasting men with downward stomps of their roboticized feet. While one of them was clearly armed with some kind of massive flamethrower, The other three had smaller, slug-throwing weapons in its place. Weapons they aimed out at the others in the room, Boba included. Cursing, but knowing a lost cause when he saw one, Boba lowered the two blasters he'd drawn, placing them down on the ground and raising his arms. The others in the room slowly followed suit, speeding up when two of the warriors discharged their weapons, turning a couple of would-be heroes into smears against the wall. Bib Fortuna kneeled on the ground beside Jabba, hands raised in trembling supplication, while his master, clearly flushed with fear, maintained a more dignified posture.
Ko arga ubata kono ingo mabinki dunko ikavis? Ji amata grancha jabatahat. Mafrinki arga nono arta anrawik.
Jabba the Hutt's about to be turned into Jabba the Fucked is more apt at this point.
Anve revini chos chowang vi.
Jabba demanded,
Bye,
though
Jabba.
whoever these men were, they seemed unimpressed to the point of
They're not gonna
ignoring
care.
him. An uncommon sight. Having subdued the room, the four maintained their guarding positions, weapons leveled, saying nothing, and waiting. Soon enough, the sound of many booted footsteps could be heard echoing down towards them, drawing closer and closer. Men and women in bright green and white uniforms stormed inside, moving around the larger warriors that had come before them, half setting up to support them, while the other half created a small cordon and saluted. Boba heard one final set of footfalls approaching, and watched on as an old man entered the main room and strode between the assembled and saluting officers, waving them to ease as he did. He leaned on a cane, no, a toothed sword of some kind, which he seemed to be using to support himself, though the Fett was uncertain if this was a sign of true impairment or an affect, for the man was huge. Not as large as the armored warriors that had breached the palace, but he was certainly the largest old man Boba had ever seen. He wore a tall red hat, and his matching coat was so heavy with medals, seals, and ornaments that they may have served as effective battle armor. And it was not just the symbols that impressed upon the clone that this man was of a respected station. The way his men watched him as he passed, the pride which emanated from them at his mere glance. These subtle signs spoke twice as loudly as the motley of medals the old man wore on his chest. His face was a history of lines and scars, and yet he wore an easy smile, even as he carefully picked his way over and around the smeared and charred corpses which lay in his path. The man came to stand before Jabba and gave the barest incline of his head. One of the larger warriors, the one who carried the flamethrower, left his position and came to stand beside the man, who then began to speak. His language was alien, but was promptly translated by the hulking soldier beside him. Boba Fett listened closely then, as the red old man introduced himself.
Forbida to suva introdudu majesty. Ujiji ava urginki niba of fumta uba maya asva. Ujiji ara replicati of ta imperium du mankind. An ara nuba arigava ta vis planitu. Jivudu aprisha if uba gold anva duku questi che uvu.
Translated the warrior. Jabba did not respond right away, sizing the man up, and then the men around them, before finally giving his answer.
If dawaga ala du uba nibad, uba shuva ava juda asbakaji. Ta grancha Jabba su du benuti lust, antuja du skilva an kunfidu, jitinka dalava kulva bi, muka jiji kulva choba e opa ofo. Asva du questi, Jil angvag uba, anten, Gigi kaga deswi mogo, mukakavo matari, dovangi visplika uba mafa.
Boba was both impressed and amused. Clearly Jabba had no choice, even if he insisted on acting as though he did. The invader in red did not seem perturbed by this, though. More than happy to continue in that tone, so long as it got him what he wanted. Boba leaned in slightly, attentive, making certain to memorize his name now that Jabba had asked for it.
Manara sa Caiaphas King.
Yes!
Anji am nawa as du hero of ta imperium.
Said the trans.
Oh shit! Oh shit! Everyone is fucked. Where's Jurgen? Where's Jurgen?
Later.
Where's my boy? Caiaphas King, hero of the Imperium. Okay, real quick, I'm going to do a self-plug for any Star Wars fan that doesn't know why I freaked out right there. I have a video called 5-ish Minute Lores about Caiaphas Cain. Ciaphascain. Caiaphas Cain. Caiaphas Cain. Oh my god, I fucking love this shit. As soon as I started hearing the rhythm, and I was like, this seems kind of familiar. You know, this seems kind of familiar. And then all of a sudden it was like, no fucking way.
Vader in red did not seem perturbed by this, though.
No
More
fucking
than happy
way.
to continue in that tone, so long as it got him what he
The
wanted.
homie is here.
Boba leaned in slightly, attentive, making certain to memorize his name now that Jabba had asked for it.
Manara sa Caiaphas King. Anji am nawa as du hero of ta imperium.
Said the translator.
Fucking love it.
The Lord Admiral rolled onto her side, red satin sheets sliding over artificial and natural skin. She shifted again, and then once more before sighing. She sat up, yawning and stretching her left arm, which was still mostly flesh and steel, unlike her right limb, which was quite thoroughly mechanical. None but the profoundly knowledgeable or uncommonly vigilant would ever notice, however, as she had taken great pains to ensure as seamless a set of augmentations as she could. But no matter the artistry of the prosthesis, or the bribes she offered the adepts of the machine cult, only so much could be done, and metal was not flesh, no matter what they believed. She was grateful to the tech priests and the Omnissiah for their work, yet the more mechanical she became, the less she found herself able to sleep through the resting cycle. What had once been a nightly routine had become a bi-daily event at best. While it was technically true that she did not need to sleep any longer, not since her latest surgeries, she had been informed that it would still be possible. And in spite of how vulnerable she was while doing anything resembling sleep, Rolla Sindura still found herself desiring it deeply. The Admiral pushed her feet over the side of the bed and shivered as she felt the cold of the floor through her lower limbs, which mirrored her arms in that they too were divided between the half-mechanical and the wholly artificial. She took a moment to distract herself, trying to notice the precise differences in the sensation based on what each foot felt. It was more painful, she realized. The Mechanicus had learned how to wire nerves into human spines as easily as a seamstress might stitch clothes to seam or...
I'm still trying to get over the fact that Caiaphas Cain is in the Star Wars universe. It's over. The greatest commissar on that part of the galaxy.
or cut.
Like the top three.
They had become
Kane,
so
Gaunt,
proficient, in
and,
fact, that they had
of
managed to
course,
create
Yari.
artificial nerve endings which felt everything but pain. And it was only after one possessed such nerves that one realized a startling truth. Everything hurts. Petting a canid, drinking recaft, taking a soft shit. All of it hurt. Though regular humans simply couldn't tell, since pain that subtle could only register if a person had the opportunity to compare life without it. And without the perfect nerve tuning of the tech priests, it would have been impossible to even experience that difference. Rolla imagined that this was one of the revelations of augmentation lauded by the priesthood, since it reminded her who and what she was, and what it was to be human. Those thoughts quickly led her back to her former sour musings on sleep, or her lack thereof. True human rest, like she had once enjoyed. Yes, even though most of her dreams were nightmares nowadays, and had been long before her upgrades. Yes, despite the fact that most of the sleep she did manage to secure for herself ended in a cold sweat or worse. But the terror of the night was a small price to pay for that.
And how about this? I keep on stopping this, but how about the fact that the theme song that as soon as that theme song came up, Brew Valvabusa, we miss you. We miss you. Vampire is good, but I miss text-to-speech. Badly.
Dark, mindless rest that always came with some portion of her sleep. And besides, she was a human. And no matter the belief of the Martians, there was nothing more ubiquitous about the human experience than suffering. Nothing. She stood and strode over to her wardrobe, rejuvenated skin and synth flesh sheathed in a modest black nightgown. With a flick of her thoughts, the wardrobe opened and deployed, unfurling before her in jerky, mechanical fashion, its many robotic display hooks and arms holding out her various uniforms and dresses like a cadre of faceless servants. She perused her options, selecting a black uniform with golden trim and a particularly audacious shoulder ornamentation over her right side. She did not trust her servants to prepare her clothing beyond laundering them, nor to witness her in any vulnerability that one could call nakedness. She was the Lord Admiral. She sat atop a harrowing pyramid of death, intrigue, and eternal ambition. Of the first two, she was full to bursting. But concerning the final trait, hers had nearly run dry. How many assassination attempts, from forces within or without, has she survived over the years, for no greater reason than this? Centuries of work and combat, and what could she even accomplish here, aside from maintaining the status quo? Now, however, things were starting to change. She looked up at herself as she finished donning her uniform and hardened her gaze. Drawing in a deep breath, Rolla closed her eyes, and with the hand of her mind collected all the loose strands of drive which remained within the beautiful bionic husk of her form. She gathered them and compressed them, drawing from them a strength that she had used to slay whole civilizations. When her eyes opened once more, they blazed with her old, raging fervor. Even a spark could light a flamer, and she found herself prepared, and not a moment too soon. A beep at her door indicated someone seeking to enter her chamber.
"Who is it?"
she asked into the air. A small vox near the mirror she gazed into spoke the answer in the voice of her guard captain. "Message for you, ma'am," said Alvat from outside. "It's from the Skywatch. I think they are moving to an objective," he added a moment later. She nodded, though he could not see it. She had been expecting this. After all, Space Marines were what they were, and what they were was not idle.
And what the Skywatch
Very well.
is,
I'll receive it on the
is-
bridge. Let us see where the old Marine thinks we should unsheath the Emperor's sword.
CT-7226, the clone trooper otherwise known as Bucket, spun in his chair, his helmeted head lolling lazily from side to side. Dr. Sheena tried not to pay any attention to his fidgeting, knowing it was his own way of coping with the silent stress which filled the air. Instead, she redirected her focus to the lab results being projected before her hover chair. The images, reports, and various results of tests played out before the Syrian scientist in a slow stream of movement. Her ample brow creased, and she rubbed her aching eyes. She was unsure if she had been getting adequate sleep, but knew her eyes would be tired either way. After all, she had been doing a lot of work. All of it, in fact. Sheena hated doing this all on her own, but she had no choice in the matter. After what she had discovered about the source of Captain Kraken's orders, she knew the Supreme Chancellor could not be trusted. In fact, precious few could. They were sitting, waiting inside the room of one such rare individual right at this very moment. Or at least, a person she thought fell into that category. The very notion of trusting anyone with any of this made her skin crawl, much less someone she did not even know. But she had no choice in the matter. None. After all, while she could run blood tests, follow up reports, compile data, perform analysis, and test her hypotheses all on her own, she could not make a difference without the aid of Padme Amidala. The senator from Naboo was currently occupied in a session of the Senate, but was expected to return very soon. In that time, she and Bucket had been allowed to sit and wait for her within the lounging area of her senatorial suite, observed passively by two of Padme's household attendants. It was Sheena's hope that this woman would know the right people and have the right personal influence to make the right kind of difference. A person who might even be able to help her avert the disaster she knew would soon be coming. But hoping, well, that too made her skin crawl. And so Sheena distracted herself with analysis, and there was, admittedly, a lot to distract her with.
By the stars! Bucket, look at this!
She said,
"Fuck
gesturing
it."
for him to come closer while enlarging an image of her holographic file and extending it up. The clone groaned and slumped at the call, but began to get up lazily so he could come see, grumbling all the while. Come on, Doc. You know I never understand any of this stuff. I'm not a scientist or anything. Clone trooper, remember? He said as he came to stand beside the chair, leaning against the thick, high-backed portion of it.
Oh, stop grumbling. This is really, well, it's fascinating.
She said, gesturing towards the image. Displayed and spinning slowly was a strand of thick, enlarged DNA. Bucket stared at it for a couple of seconds and then shrugged his shoulders. Corellian Sugartail? He asked unhelpfully. Sheena smacked her hand against her face and sighed.
By the many moons, Bucket, even you should know what DNA is.
She groaned. Yeah, I do, he said with a laugh. I'm just flicking your wires. Still, can't tell what's so special about it. Is this some kind of, important difference? That my DNA? Yours? He asked. Dr. Sheena scowled and shook her head.
No, you dolt. It's DNA collected from some of the Imperial soldiers during the invasion of Axum.
She said. Okay, and? He asked.
It's thick.
She said, gesturing to enlarge the image even more. Thick?
Thick?
He asked a moment later.
Yes, it's too thick. Look.
Dr. Sheena tapped away at a console on her armrest, and an image of another, thinner strand of DNA was projected next to the first. They turned beside each other, very similar, yet also distinct. That is yours, or at least close to yours. The second strand is an example of the clone template. Dr. Sheena explained. Django. Bucket said softly. She nodded. So, wait, why are they so different? Aren't they supposed to be human, just like Jango Fett was? He asked.
Well, yes and no. They are definitely human, or at least human-derived. The match in the genome sequence is uncanny. They aren't just like humans, they encompass humans. And much more,
she said. Much more? How? He asked.
I am not sure. I thought it was genetic augmentation at first, but the more I look at it, the more it just seems like standard mutative gene progression. I'm not a geneticist, strictly speaking, so I've been doing a lot of referencing and comparison, but that only made this stranger. I mean, I saw similar structures in Kaminoans and Arcanians, but nothing quite like this.
Bucket stood back at that, seemingly aghast. Wait, these Imperials are part Kaminoan? He asked.
No, that's not what I meant, Sheena said, raising a hand. I mean, both the Kaminoans and the Arcanians have very shaped, directed gene patterns. They achieved this largely through eugenics,
she said. Eugenics? He asked.
Yes, selective breeding and the culling of defective and undesirable traits. The Imperials have similar gene structures, but, well, look at how thick their DNA is.
It's thick.
I don't know how to account for that,
she said. Well, what does thicker DNA even mean? He asked. What else has thick DNA? She paused before answering him, stroking her chin as she pondered the question.
Again, I'm well read, but not a gene expert myself, so this is probably wildly off the mark. But if I had to give a face value explanation of what this should mean, it would mean that they are older than the rest of the human race,
she said at length. Older? The clone parroted.
Yes, older, much older. Between 80 and 60,000 years older if I had to guess. But that doesn't make any sense. Even accounting for light speed relativity, the difference is so drastic it almost implies time travel.
She was cut off as the doors into the senator's suite slid open with a rustle. Both Sheena and her clone bodyguard snapped rigid and turned to see who was entering, both slackening at the same time as well when they saw Padme and her attendants begin to filter in.
Ah, Dr. Sheena,
Padme greeted, smiling warmly as she came to take the woman's hand in both of her own.
It's a pleasure to meet you, and your escort as well.
Bucket beamed inside his helmet, and Sheena offered a nervous smile of her own.
Thank you for seeing me, Senator. I know you must be very busy, but I assure you, what I need to say is of vital importance,
she said. Padme's smile withered slightly, and she nodded more seriously, cautiously taking a seat nearby, being careful with her pregnant belly. Sheena spied that the senator was quite far along, and was shocked to realize that, in her vast memory, she could not recall the father to the popular senator's soon-to-be-born child. Odd.
Yes, your holo suggested that much. How can I help you? Are you in trouble?
Padme asked, eyes full of worry for the Syrian, despite her own vulnerable state. Sheena nodded and eyed the senator's attendants wearily. The women, of which there were 3, lingered near the back of the room silently, waiting to be needed. Padme seemed to notice Dr. Sheena's stare and followed it, a twinge of pained frustration flashing across her face before looking back at her guest. You can trust me, and you can trust them, I swear it, she said without hesitation. Sheena paused for a time, but then nodded slowly and turned back to the senator. Senator Amidala, I am in danger, and so are you, so are we all, she said. From what? Padme asked. The Syrian doctor paused again, a true sense of anxiety rushing through her, like the last look over the edge before leaping from a terminally high cliff. But before she managed to muster her courage, Bucket spoke for her, stepping forward as he did. The Supreme Chancellor, ma'am. We have reason to suspect that he is behind the hyperspace ramming incident around Pazob. Padme's face seemed to go blank with shock before a streak of subtle agony crossed her features again, and she shook off the surprise. These are serious suspicions. What can you tell me about why you believe this? Asked the senator. It's all right here, Sheena said, supplying the data she had managed to slice earlier that same day. Time was taken to show her what the data meant, how it proved some connection between the ship that had presumably begun the war and the office of the Supreme Chancellor. This isn't much, Padme said at the end of it all. Maybe not enough for a court, but it's enough for people like us, Sheena insisted.
These records prove that there was some undisclosed message sent from the Supreme Chancellor's office to the Belligeor just before it suicide rammed the Imperial ship. This entire war could well be a result of that single action. And besides, Senator, I know that you are not blind. I've seen your speeches and seen your vote record. You know how dangerous the Chancellor is, and you know that he already has far too much power. He's planning something, and all of this, even this new war, are all a part of it.
The doctor almost yelled.
That is enough, Dr. Sheena.
Padme suddenly cried out, shocking the Syrian into silence. She panted and wiped at some sweat on her brow.
I'm sorry,
she said a moment later.
Please forgive me. I'm not feeling well. But yes, I know. I am aware of the threat posed by the Chancellor and that there is much that he has not told us. I am aware,
she said, resting her head in one hand. Dr. Sheena narrowed her eyes somewhat.
Senator Amidala, are you due?
She asked. The senator looked up, a slight blush touching her cheeks before she swooned in a sudden flood of agony, groaning loudly as she did. Her attendants rushed forward, but she recovered and waved them back.
No, not yet. I have to go to Axum first.
Why?
I have to tell Anakin.
She groaned as she tried to lay back and breathe.
Anakin? Anakin Skywalker? Senator, with all due respect, you should be doing no such thing. Besides, what news could you possibly have to give Anakin Skywalker?
Figure it out.
The man is locked within an unsanctioned battle with the Imperials at this very moment.
Figure it out.
Nothing you could tell him would be relevant to that.
Figure it
Dr.
out.
Sheena said, waving the attendants forward in spite of Padme's former gestures.
You're wrong,
Padme said, before another rush of pain took her. The forestalled attendants came to either side of her, taking her hands as more sweat shone on her face.
I have to tell him.
The senator insisted, even as a liquid stain began to appear on her dress, and her aides began to urgently call for medical aid. But Dr. Sheena was not so distracted by their concerns and panic that she did not hear the next few words the laboring senator managed to speak.
He is the Supreme Commander of the Republic now.
Wait, what? What just happened?
Davik
What
Thune
just
had
happened?
ensured that there were at least 2 strike cruisers cutting across the skies of Raxus Secundus, even before the battle within the void had become a foregone affair. Amid an oncoming ocean of particulate death and strobing light-based lethality, the world below them had elected to activate a series of powerful, overlapping shield generators. Yet they had failed to act before the Chapter Master, having been entirely unprepared for the sudden assault. The Imperial fleet had begun bombardment of the world, only to find their blows energetically blunted by the infrastructure below them. Before any major corrective actions could be taken, a second Separatist fleet had arrived to relieve the assault of the planet. The Void battle had been rejoined, but while it was fought, and Davik threw his might against the aforementioned General Grievous, the strike cruisers had deployed their tactical teams across the world, barely managing to stay ahead of the fields of defensive fire that the planet threw up towards the trapped cruisers. It was, however, those very conditions that lent the deployed Space Marines their vital sense of urgency. Landing amid artistically crafted cities, plains of burning gold, and polar ice caps shrouded in haloed auroras, the only binding similarity between their locations was their objectives, their targets. The massive and vital planetary shield generators. The deployed tactical and assault squads were swift and lethal, calling down reinforcements when they earned significant footholds and swiftly building up force on several combat theaters. They sought, one and all, to break into the defensive installations which surrounded each of their tactical objectives. In minutes, each and every one of the shield generators were under assault, and tens of minutes later, they would begin to fall, one by
So
one.
Grievous is now in the theater.
Brother Arachnus stood guard around a smoldering corner within a massive room. Beside him was the huge, energetically pulsating generator, humming and filling the air with a static charge that caused a slight fuzzing in his helmet's auspex. But not enough of one to prevent him from noticing the approaching droids. He hefted his mighty bolter and looked down the sights. Though the room was very large, with an extremely high ceiling, most of that space was taken up by the shield-emitting machinery it was meant to house, forcing the remaining interior space into cramped walkways, gangways, and elevated graded balconies and their adjoining ramps. This, in turn, forced the droids to march in columns, their weaker, thinner units moving forward as faltering shields for their more advanced units behind. The tactic seemed sound, but it was all but ignored in the face of penetrating bolter fire.
Yeah.
B-1 battle droids, B-2 battle droids, and even destroyers found themselves all but helpless in the face of the Astartes' chosen weapon. Admittedly, the shielded destroyer droids needed to be shot at before they unrolled and opened their shields. But doing so was a trivial game for the Space Marine, and one which he had mastered in little time. This time, however, the tactic was different. The destroyers advanced from the front, already deployed and crawling along at their snail's pace, while behind them, the skinny, skeletal-like B-1s marched in rank. And behind them, the similar but endlessly more problematic black skeletons of the commando droids, each one bearing a thick, humming vibro sword, marched as well.
That's a blasted puzzle.
The Space Marine said to himself,
Can't shoot through them. Toss a grenade and the black ones will toss it back. And if I close for melee, the white ones will scrap themselves, buying chances for the black ones to skew. Whoa!
he exclaimed as the B-1s suddenly drew grenades from around their waists and reeled back their arms, pitching them over the shields. Arachnus opened fire, catching most of the spheres in the air over the destroyers, though the blasts failed to reach them through their shields. He caught one of the grenades that had been tossed over, pitching it back and kicking the other two that landed nearby to the same effect, bouncing the deadly explosives off the walls and grates to veer back towards the droids. But they all detonated too soon to catch them. The destroyers opened fire while he was distracted, and the Marine was shoved back behind his corner by the sudden heated impact of one of their larger particle bolts. He checked his smoldering armor, finding 2 impact sites on the left side of his chest, both bleached of their paint and puckered, but intact. He grinned, actually feeling a bit of earned adrenaline flood his system as he peeked back at their advancing lines. The white skeletons were drawing out more grenades even as he watched. This time, he took the initiative, charging out before they had time to reel back their arms for another toss. He fired a few shots to cover himself, the destroyers returning fire almost right away, but failing to connect with him as he ran and reached the wall across from where he had started, jogging forward on powered mechanical muscles. He hit the wall, but did not stop, his thick ceramite boots stomping dents into the vertical metal surface as he charged up its side, gaining altitude rapidly before reaching up with his left hand and grasping the lip of one of the lower hanging metal balconies. As he did, he allowed his right arm to aim downward, holding his thick bolter one-handed as he hung above them, unloading the full magazine into the droids below him. The maligned machines hesitated and even seemed to panic, half simply dropping their grenades to the ground as they attempted to fire up at him, while the other half stupidly activated and tossed the explosives, making themselves prime targets for his bolts.
What?
Most of the white skeletons and half of the black were eradicated right away, either caught in sprays of bolter fire or in the sudden blasts born from their own intercepted grenades. Once more, the destroyers proved resilient, though they had a lot of trouble managing their aim directly upwards. Ammo expended, Arachnus cursed and tossed away his blessed bolter and released the foot of the metal balcony, dropping down on top of both of the destroyers beneath him as he whipped out his combat knife in a single fluid motion. His boots hit the energy fields with solid thumps and screeches of reactive radiation, but after their force was stolen away, His feet began to sink through the fields almost instantly, the destroyers struggling to orient and fire accurately with the long noses of their rifles once his body began slipping past their shields. He crushed both of the destroyers under either boot, hacking their heads off with his knife before they fell away, backtracking rapidly out of the aftermath and only narrowly managing to avoid the energetic strikes of the remaining 4 commandos.
Okay.
Arachnus hopped onto his toes and began to bob and weave his massive form, making himself unpredictable, flipping his knife into a reverse grip as the 4 agile abominations spread out and drove in, aiming to cut him down from several different angles. The symmetry of their machine minds was perfect. Too perfect. For a mortal man, such calculations would have been superior. Yet, for an Astartes, such things, while still blindingly fast, were predictable. When he observed the even spacing between all 4 vectors, their synchronized striking patterns, and their use of ordered, almost predetermined executions, Arachnus realized these combat AI were far from the most lethal he had ever contended with. Which was good, because they outnumbered him by a large margin. Once more, he took the initiative, running in towards their center and diving down into a boot-first slide. The 2 who had attempted to flank him found themselves scraping unwillingly past their target, servos screeching as they attempted to redirect their momentum to catch him. The 2 near the center drove their swords down, seeking to impale the Marine as he slid low between them. His blade-bearing hand deflected one strike, while the other, free hand, slapped the flat of one of the blades, knocking it aside and taking the offending droid by the wrist. It all happened in mere milliseconds, and then he was past, dragging one of the black skeletons after him as he rolled upright, crushing and smashing it against his knees and body as he did, letting it drop once he had risen and stomping over its face and chest. The remaining 3 had not paused to mourn their 4th, however, and now they all drove in from the center, each covering the other. Arachnus reached down with a numb, free hand, fumbling for a smoke grenade as he retreated back. The delay in his reaction almost cost him dearly as the droids forced him to hasten his retreat, cutting shallow slices out of his armor as they sought his vitals. Their vibroblades turning the ceramite they touched to fine powder. The adamantium blade of his knife held back their most lethal strikes, however, and after a brief round of parrying and counter-strikes, he leapt back once more, throwing his smoke grenade into their faces. The grenade, of course, produced much more than smoke, emitting 32 kinds of sensory impairment countermeasures. The cloud of smoke both shimmering brightly at first before becoming opaque as night. The droids floundered, blind and deaf in the sudden mire, but Brother Arachnus, just as deaf and just as blind, did not. His photo-perfect memory held the exact instant before his grenades had detonated crisp and clear in his mind, and he let it, his speed, and his predictions guide him. And they guided him true. Steel spilled steel in the screeching union of death meeting false life. And when the cloud of billowing, storm-like smoke cleared, Arachnus stood over the butchered corpses of the 3 remaining commando droids. He looked up, locating his bolter, and taking it up again, checking it for damage and then reloading the sturdy implement of doom. Staring back down the way the droids had come, he could see no more approaching. Yet, when he turned to take up his position again, he found something else standing there, by the corner. A man, an old man. He stood regally, with an air of imperious authority that Arachnus had seen on many inquisitors and lord generals alike. Though this person, whoever he was, could be neither. He wore the stylish but comparatively plain clothing of this planet's nobility, and he bore no obvious cybernetics or signs of rejuvenation, despite the fact that his hair was nearly as white as his sickly old skin. For all the signs of his advanced age, however, Arachnus could see no weakness within the man, and the red, glowing blade of light which the man held out to his side was all the sign the Space Marine needed to know that this man was a hostile force. For a brief moment, both locked eyes through Arachnus' helmet lenses, neither moving, and then, in a sudden burst signaled by nothing
Is this creamy Sheev?
more than instinct, Both warriors reeled up in action and extended their lethal powers towards the other. Arachnus pivoted on his heel, bringing his bolter to bear and unloading his freshly replaced magazine. Self-propelled bolts screamed through the air like miniature meteors, bursting and exploding violently as they made contact with the stream of warp lightning that poured out from the fingers of the old man's free hand. Arachnus cursed his bad luck. Another witch! The surge of corrupting power traveled up the rain of exploding bolts like a nest of hungering snakes, entering the barrel of the gun and forcing Arachnus to toss away his weapon just as it exploded. The fragments of his beloved bolter showered him in a hateful rain of burning metal as he drew out his combat knife again. But he barely had time to intercept the red blade of his enemy's...
Okay, if anybody's wondering, Palpatine should win this hands down. He is the most powerful dark side force user in this galaxy, and this is a regular Space Marine.
Weapon as it came upon him, stabbing towards one of his two hearts. The adamantium of his combat knife lit and glowed like molten steel, but managed to push aside the lethal bar of light before it could pierce his body. The old man had traveled very far, and the strength in his arm was far greater than that of a normal human. Arachnus sought to strike at the man, but couldn't find a moment or opening to do so, wincing and backstepping as he contended with the dueling psyker's rapid pace. His knife was burning his hand even through his armor, and he pushed away and barely avoided strike after strike. Bright orange lines appearing across his armor as the near misses began to pile up. All the while, the man he fought kept a smug, imperious expression, his body moving like a wicker doll, precisely shifted and controlled on strings and strength born of the hellish warp. The front of the Astartes' boot came away, taking most of his foot with it. Then a portion of his forearm was seared off, and then a bright tongue of fiery pain licked across his thigh. Arachnus heard more than felt his combat knife fall out of his useless hand as the witch's red blade bit deeply into his wrist, using the loss to raise his free arm and bring it down in a murderous haymaker destined for the old man's head. But this too was stopped when the Psyker thrust his own free hand into the Space Marine's chest, pushing hard and throwing the warrior back against the wall, where his injuries forced him to slump down and collapse. He reached up and activated his Vox with his one good hand.
Petus, Olantis, I am defeated. The enemy has me and will be upon you soon. He is a single psyker with a power sword.
The Marine began to report. Save your breath. They are already dead.
Oh.
The old man said in flawless high Gothic, the result of a collar-mounted translator device, Arachnus would realize. More droids appeared then, the black kind, but not from outside the perimeter, as he would have
I didn't know why I forgot about Dooku. I thought it was Creamy Sheev.
expected, instead appearing from behind the position he had taken up beforehand, from where his fellow Marines should have been. He growled viciously, trying to rise, and failing as the old Psyker came to stand over him, staring down his nose at the defeated Astartes with only a mild disdain.
More of us are coming. This planet will be ours.
Arachnus spat, hatred grinding past every syllable he spoke. The old man merely raised a sarcastic eyebrow, and then laughed lightly and once. Then, without warning, he plunged his saber into the Marine's primary heart, holding it there, and using the warp to restrain Arachnus' remaining functional limb as he did. You lost this war before you started, fool, he said before twisting the red blade and tearing it out the side of Brother Arachnus' chest, cutting through his remaining second heart in the process. The Space Marine rasped one last hateful breath, before the light faded from his eyes and he slumped down into eternal stillness. The Sith Lord deactivated his blade and sighed, wiping a sheen of sweat from his wrinkled forehead. That should be all of them, he said. We have located the charges they set. Should we begin disarming them? Asked one of the nearby commando droids. No, you heard the savage. There will be more of them, and even if we protected this generator, I cannot protect them all, said Count Dooku. Roger, Roger. What next? Asked the droid. Prepare the stealth ship. I'm evacuating the planet, he said, turning away from the large corpse he had created and walking towards the hangar. Very well. Shall I inform the rest of the Separatist Council? The droid asked, following at Dooku's right as the other commando droids began to salvage what they could from the dead Marine, as they had done with the others. And risk informing the Imperials of my intentions? No. And besides, with the arrival of this new foe, I do believe that the Council has now outlived its purpose. Assure them that the shields will hold, and that Grievous will come for them. Say no more than that. If they ask for me, inform them that I am valiantly defending their safety. The Sith Lord said. He then turned to the droid and paused. How is General Grievous progressing on his front? He asked. The droid paused for a moment, receiving information before responding. Not well. It appears that General Grievous will be unable to prevent the Imperial fleet from continuing its bombardment. Estimations dictate it will be anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes before the bombardment resumes, it said. Count Dooku considered that, and then shrugged, continuing on his way. A pity. Truly a pity.
Suffer not the unclean to live. Lead us from death to victory, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair to hope.
Okay, so that was Beyond Axum. It was everything that you guys said it was going to be. So we have the introduction of Padme, Anakin somehow the Supreme Commander, and of course, ya boy, he's here. Caiaphas is here. Joy. In any case, yeah, this was worth it. This was worth it. I will catch you guys next time for episode 25.